The second half of the Odyssey is a drama of identity disguised and revealed, a series of artful variations on the recognition scene. Bear this in mind for each of the next several chapters, for everyone will eventually recognize King Odysseus, whether by his design or not. Also, in this chapter we get an interesting insight from Homer on the relationship between the human mind and the human will. Hello and welcome back. My name is Zachary May, and today we're reading the great books of Western civilization together, continuing with the Odyssey. This is the Robert Fagles translation, Book 17, and as always, I'll start with a brief plot summary before getting into analysis and commentary. Telemachus rises and takes his leave of the swineherd on his way to the palace. He orders him to bring the beggar into town, pretending to not want to have to deal with hosting him anymore. The beggar also announces that he doesn't want to stay at the farm anyway. Telemachus gets on his way, arriving at the palace. As the maids rejoice that he is okay, his mother comes down from her chambers, overjoyed at his return. She asks him for news of his father, but Telemachus refuses to answer right now, for he has just escaped death, does not want to be moved to tears, and has a guest of his own, the prophet, to attend to. He tells her to go and bathe and promise a sacrifice to the gods if only they will bring about their day of revenge. His mother is struck silent and obeys. He goes into the town and meets his comrade, bringing Theoclymenus, the prophet. He asks his comrade to hold on to the gifts from Menelaus for now, just in case the suitors end up killing him instead of the other way around. He then leads the prophet with him back to the palace. Once there, they bathe and eat. Penelope once again approaches her son to ask for news of Odysseus and to tell quickly before the suitors come back to the house. Telemachus now obliges, telling everything about his visits to Pylos and Sparta, including the entire story that Menelaus told him, that Odysseus was in fact alive, imprisoned on Calypso's island. Hearing the story, Theoclymenus declares a prophecy himself, that Odysseus is in fact here, on the island, plotting death for the suitors. Penelope is hesitant to fully believe it, but is hopeful nonetheless. After a day of games and amusement outside, the suitors come inside the palace for supper. Meanwhile, the swineherd leads the beggar into the town, though hesitantly, knowing the danger. On the way, they encounter Melanthius, a goatherd and a servant of the suitors. He insults the two of them and kicks at the beggar. Odysseus keeps control of his temper, and the pair move on. As they approach the palace, they agree that Eumaeus will go in first, closely followed by the beggar. As they discuss this, though, Odysseus' dog, Argos, 20 years old, hears his master's voice. He's too old and sick to make any sound or move toward him, but his tail wags as he watches. The dog then dies that very instant. The beggar enters the palace amongst Telemachus, Eumaeus, Penelope, her maids, the suitors, and all the other servants. Eumaeus brings him a serving of food, and then Athena tells Odysseus to go and beg for food from each of the suitors in order to test them. As he begins to do so, the suitors wonder who he is aloud, enraged that such a one has been allowed inside to eat the house's food. The goatherd from the road identifies Eumaeus as the one who brought this beggar inside. An argument ensues between Antinous, Eumaeus, and Telemachus over why and whether the beggar can be here, and whether he should be cast out. Just as they're finishing, the beggar comes to Antinous at last to ask him for a scrap of food. Antinous refuses and insults him, finally hurling a chair that breaks against his back. The beggar calls attention to this brazen disregard for hospitality displayed by Antinous and lays a curse on him, calling for the god's vengeance. While Antinous himself is unmoved by this threat, the other suitors tell him he is without a doubt gone too far. Telemachus holds his tongue, but builds his anger up quietly. Penelope hears of what has happened and asks Eumaeus to invite the beggar to speak with her. The beggar agrees to speak with Penelope in private after nightfall, when the suitors have left. Penelope agrees. Eumaeus then takes his leave. Starting from the beginning of this chapter, after father and son have made their plans together, Telemachus begins to play a role, an act, in such a way as to further the mission, but it's not authentic to what he himself would actually do. Most of the time, this role involves acting as if he's a much worse host and a much more rude one than he actually is. Take a look at the beginning of this chapter. "Send the beggar away, I can't be bothered," he says this to Eumaeus. We can tell that this is a role because of Odysseus' reaction when he's disguised as the beggar. "Sure, man, sounds good. I was just leaving anyway." If he really was a beggar, concerned for his well-being and reliant upon the generosity of this host for his life, surely he would have begged for another night in the hut or even at the palace. But no, Odysseus' compliance is what cues us in. So as we read ahead, bear this in mind, as we'll explain many things that Telemachus says that, again, are more cruel and perhaps even more submissive sometimes than we'd normally expect from him. He comes close to breaking character a few times too, but usually catches himself. We'll talk about one of those instances in just a minute. Take a look at how Telemachus speaks to his mother when she first greets him at the entrance of the palace. "You're home, Telemachus. I never thought I'd see you again. Out for news of your dear father. Quick, tell me, did you catch sight of the man? Meet him? What?" He refuses to talk. "I've just escaped from death. Sudden death. No. Bathe now, put on some fresh clothes, go to your own room, pray Zeus will grant us the hour of our revenge." He says he has to go and see to his guest, the prophet, and he does. But when he returns, his mother addresses him once more, and her words reveal that she has sensed some other motive behind his refusal. "But you never had the heart. Now, before those insolent suitors crowd back to the house, tell me clearly about your father's journey home, if you've heard any news." And she is right. "Of course, mother, I will tell you the whole true story now." Even though Penelope has obeyed her son's wishes in stunned silence before, I theorize that this time it was because she sensed something was up, which I think this interaction supports. As I said at the end of the last video, tensions are very high. Everyone's preparing for violence for one reason or another. It's almost like everybody knows, subconsciously, perhaps, that Odysseus is here, even though they don't. Telemachus asks his mother to pray for the hour of our revenge, instead of going to weave like in Book 1. We are told that the suitors had put off their plan to kill the prince, and even so, we are also told now in this book that they approach him with welcome words on their lips and murder in their hearts. Even the swineherd, who persistently doubts that the king is alive, prays for Odysseus to return and straighten out the insolent goatherd on the road. Heck, Theoclymenus the prophet just got here 5 minutes ago, and even he knows that something's up. Being a prophet helps, of course. Penelope doubts Odysseus' survival too, but even she prays for the deaths of the suitors later in the chapter. This one's hilarious. "Dear God, if only Odysseus came back home. He and his son would avenge the outrage of these men." At her last words, Telemachus shook with a lusty sneeze, and the sudden outburst echoed up and down the halls. Imagine like he had spit out his drink or something. He's reacting to how close to the mark her words are. It nearly breaks him out of character. "You hear how my son sealed all I said with a sneeze? So let death come down with grim finality on these suitors, one and all, and not a single man escape his sudden doom." Hilarious as that passage is, a quick Google search will tell you that the sneeze itself was considered an omen from the gods. And as I believe has been said before, the suitors themselves are expecting some kind of comeuppance, for the outrages of some of them are even going beyond their standards of what's acceptable. "Look, Antinous, that was a crime. Your fate is sealed if he's some god come from the blue, disguised as they roam, watching over us, all our foul play. Something's coming, and everyone knows it." There's a really interesting line in this chapter when we're considering this book from the perspective of the history and development of ideas, which is part of what we do and part of why we read the great books. Take a look at when Melanthius tries to kick Odysseus off the path. Homer gives us a look into Odysseus' decision-making process. Odysseus was torn. Should he wheel with his staff and beat the scoundrel senseless? Or hoist him by the midriff, split his skull on the rocks? Decisions, am I right? He steeled himself instead. His mind in full control. His mind controls his passions. This is exactly how Plato and or Socrates theorized that the human soul was governed, centuries later in the dialogue Phaedrus. The human soul is described kind of like a chariot by Plato, where the driver is the mind and the two horses are the spirit and the body. We see that Odysseus has his soul ordered in the same way in this passage, at least according to Homer. Compare this to, say, Book 1 of the Iliad, where Achilles is about to kill Agamemnon, even going through a very similar inner dialogue, except for him, a god had to hold him back from it. He didn't think of a reason to maybe hold off, he had to be commanded, which is right in line with the Iliad, where the The passions and people's decisions are very much directed by the gods. Whereas in the Odyssey, like I've said before, there's a much greater emphasis on free will and human choosing. And as you'll eventually see, Homer's thoughts on this have even influenced Plato's on the subject, centuries in advance. A professor I had once said that literature is the only medium by which truths of human nature can be found centuries ahead of philosophy and theology. Even though Plato isn't necessarily entirely correct about how he views the human soul, we clearly see this principle at work. Homer, writing centuries before Plato, and perhaps over the course of centuries too, understands something fundamental about us, about human nature, that the philosophers have not figured out yet. Don't let anybody tell you that stories are just stories. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. Also comment below and let me know what you think about Homer's vision of the soul here, exemplified in this one disagreement on the road. Do you think that I'm reading too much into it? Is Homer predicting what Plato will eventually say? Do you even think that Plato is right? Does the mind control the passions? Let me know what you think down below. We'll see you next time.